If you are into ship models, you have probably wondered, what is the greatest ship model ever created? For many historians and master builders, one answer rises above the rest. The Soleil Royal model in the collection of the Musée National de la Marine. Not simply because it represents one of the most legendary warships of the Age of Sail, but because this model exists at the crossroads of naval history, sculpture, archaeology, and extraordinary 19th century craftsmanship. In today's video, we're going to uncover the story behind this masterpiece, the legendary warship it represents, the artist who built it, and why this single model became one of the most celebrated ship models ever made. The 1:40 scale Soleil Royal model displayed today at the Musée National de la Marine is a reconstruction of the French first-rate ship of the line, Soleil Royal, flagship of King Louis XIV during the late 17th century. The model itself was built around 1839 by the master craftsman Jean-Baptiste Tanneron. But unlike the official builders' models of the Royal Navy, models constructed alongside the real ships for admirals and naval architects, Tanneron's Soleil Royal was built more than a century after the original warship had already vanished. So why was it built? What sources did Tanneron use to reconstruct a lost ship from another era? And how did this model become not just a reconstruction, but a masterpiece? Well, before we answer all of those questions, we first need to understand the ship itself. Because the real Soleil Royal was never a warship, it was a propaganda carved in wood and gold, a floating palace, a political weapon built to project the absolute power of France, and the ego of one man, King Louis XIV. The Soleil Royal, Royal Sun in English, was constructed during one of the most transformative periods in French naval history. When Louis XIV began his personal rule in 1661, France's navy lagged far behind those of England and the Dutch Republic, but Louis had no intention of remaining a secondary maritime power. Together with his brilliant minister, Jean-Baptiste Tanneron, he launched an enormous naval expansion program designed to transform France into the dominant power of Europe, not only on land, but at sea. And at the center of that vision stood the Soleil Royal. The ship was laid down at Brest in 1668 and launched in 1669 on the master shipwright Laurent Cubac. This was not merely another ship of the line, it was intended to become the crown jewel of the new French fleet, the 17th century equivalent of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Everything about it was designed to send a message: France has arrived. Even its name carried political meaning. Louis XIV famously styled himself as the Sun King, Le Roi Soleil. Early in his reign, he adopted the sun as his personal emblem, associating himself with Apollo, the god of light, order, and power. And just as the planets revolved around the sun, France itself was expected to revolve around the king. The Soleil Royal embodied that idea physically. Its towering stern exploded with the gilded carvings, royal monograms, sky blue accents, and massive sculptural compositions designed by artists such as Antoine Coysevox. Apollo himself appeared across the stern, riding his horse-drawn chariot through the heavens. The ship was quite literally Versailles at the sea. But beneath all of that beauty was something equally important: intimidation. As a massive first-rate warship carrying over 100 guns, the Soleil Royal was expected to dominate enemy fleets through sheer firepower alone. And its extravagant decoration was not just vanity, it was psychological warfare. The gold leaf, the carvings, the scale of the ship, all of it announced the same message to allies and enemies alike. France was so wealthy and its king so powerful that even its weapons of war could be turned into works of art. And yet, for nearly 2 decades, the Soleil Royal saw surprisingly little action. For much of his early life, it remained in Brest almost like a ceremonial symbol of royal prestige. But then, Europe erupted into war. When the 9 Years' War began, the Soleil Royal was finally called upon to fulfill the destiny Louis XIV had imagined for it decades earlier. At the Battle of Beachy Head, serving as a flagship of Admiral Henri de Tourville, the ship helped to deliver a stunning French victory against the combined Anglo-Dutch fleet, briefly giving France control of the English Channel. For one moment, the dream worked. But only 2 years later, during the Battle of Bouvines, everything collapsed. Outnumbered and heavily damaged, the Soleil Royal was forced to run aground near Cherbourg, cornered, helpless, and unable to escape. The great flagship was attacked by English fireships and burned to the waterline. The floating palace of the Sun King vanished in flames. Or at least, the real ship did. Because more than a century later, one man would attempt to bring it back to life from memory, fragments, paintings, and imagination. And that is where the story of the famous model truly begins. That man was Jean-Baptiste Tanneron. And strangely enough, despite creating one of the most famous ship models in history, Tanneron himself remains a surprisingly shadowy figure. Very little is recorded about his early life. But judging from the extraordinary quality of his work, he was almost certainly trained in both sculpture and naval drafting traditions, common in the maritime workshops of early 19th century France. He was not simply a craftsman building miniatures. He was operating at the intersections of fine art, engineering, historical reconstruction, and museum preservation. By the 1830s, Tanneron had become known for creating highly detailed ship models for France's national maritime collections, especially for the Musée National de la Marine in Paris. His specialty was resurrecting ships that no longer existed. And that is what makes the Soleil Royal model so remarkable. Tanneron was attempting to reconstruct a warship that had already vanished beneath the sea more than 140 years earlier. There were no surviving official plans, no complete blueprints, no photographs, obviously. In many ways, he was trying to rebuild a ghost. So how do you recreate one of the most legendary warships in history when the ship itself is gone? The answer is part research and part artistic detective work. One of Tanneron's most important sources was the work of Jean-Baptiste the Elder, the famous royal designer closely associated with the court of Louis XIV. Deccan created elaborate decorative concepts for many of the Sun King's ships, especially their stern ornamentations and symbolic sculpture programs. From these drawings, Tanneron could study the massive Baroque stern decorations, the allegorical figures, the royal monograms, and the visual language surrounding the Sun King mythology itself. But decorative drawings alone could not reconstruct an entire warship. So Tanneron also immersed himself in surviving French naval architecture traditions, studying hull proportions, artillery layouts, rigging practices, and the general form of late 17th century French first rates. He combined archival research with the practical shipbuilding knowledge still preserved in France during his own time. And yet, this is where the story becomes fascinating. Because the Soleil Royal model is not necessarily an exact historical replica. Even today, historians still debate its accuracy. Some believe Tanneron may have blended features from different periods of the ship's life. Others argue the model reflects a rebuilt version of the 1680s more than the original 1669 vessel. And some details may simply be Tanneron's own artistic interpretation of what the perfect Soleil Royal should have looked like. In other words, the model exists somewhere between archaeology and imagination. But ironically, that may be exactly why it became so influential. Because whether historically perfect or not, Tanneron's creation became the definitive visual identity of the Soleil Royal. Almost every modern painting, commercial kit, illustration, or digital reconstruction of the ship ultimately traces back, directly or indirectly, to this single model. In many ways, Tanneron didn't just reconstruct the Soleil Royal, he recreated how the world imagines it. And the craftsmanship itself is almost overwhelming. According to museum records, the model was constructed from walnut, rosewood, ebony, and metal fittings. Materials carefully chosen not only for durability, but for visual effect. The dark ebony created dramatic contrast. The rosewood added warmth and richness. And the walnut allowed for incredibly fine carving work. And those carvings are everywhere. The stern erupts with sculpture detail. The quarter galleries are layered with miniature Baroque ornamentation. The figureheads alone feels like a standalone work of art. Every surface seems alive with movement, symbolism, and texture. This is the moment where the model stops feeling like a scale replica and starts feeling like a sculpture of an entire varnished age. And honestly, we are incredibly fortunate today as model builders. Because if you decide to build your own Soleil Royal, you no longer have to spend years reconstructing a lost warship from scattered drawings and historical fragments the way Jean-Baptiste Tanneron once did. Today, we have access to beautifully designed commercial kits that make these legendary ships far more approachable, while still preserving all of that grandeur, complexity, and magic that made the original model so famous. Whether it is the limited edition 1:70 scale wooden kit from OcCre, the redesigned 1:72 Soleil Royal from Artesanía Latina, or the classic 1:77 scale version from Mantua model and Sergo. There are now more ways than ever to experience this iconic ship for yourself. And if wooden ship models still feel a little intimidating right now, that is completely okay too. The 1:100 scale plastic kit from Heller remains one of the best entry points into the world of historical sailing warships, while still offering an incredibly impressive final result. Because the truth is, every modeler starts somewhere. No one begins this hobby already knowing how to rig a first-rate ship of the line or carve a Baroque ornamentation. And that is part of what makes ship modeling so rewarding. So if you have already built the Soleil Royal, or if you are dreaming about starting one someday, share your experience with us in the comments or in the community. We would genuinely love to see your build, hear your story, and celebrate your progress with you. Because at the end of the day, every finished ship model represents something much bigger than wood, plastic, or paint. It represents the countless hours of dedication required to bring a piece of history back to life with your own hands.